Urban Indian Health Institute came out with a report called Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls that did a countrywide study and ranked the number of missing and murdered Indigenous women's cases by state. And in that case, it was New Mexico that was in first.
I was going to ask, yeah.
And Washington was in second. However, Seattle actually leads the nation of the most city the city with the most missing Indigenous persons.
Is there, for those two cities specifically, or those two areas, are they able to draw any, an assumption or a conclusion as to why it's those two areas that are so prevalent?
While there is a bigger presence in the Native community, I think it also has a lot to do with the border towns and lack of jurisdiction. So unfortunately, there's a really big loophole in which state officers and tribal officers have a hard time working together. And there's really no legislation that holds state officers accountable to working with tribal officers. So this loophole makes it so that the only person who is required to intervene or to follow up on these missing cases are federal officers. And this is because the tribe is a sovereign nation.
Mm-hmm.
So the relationship is nation to nation, and that's where the federal government comes in. However, unfortunately, they very rarely send an agent. And so these cases are just being neglected and overlooked and turned cold. And it's not only the high presence of Indigenous people in that area, but also the border towns and the lack of jurisdiction.
So, and I just want to make sure that I understand the
Mm-hmm.
jurisdictional Venn diagram, if you will, that you're laying out. So on tribal land, like a state law enforcement officer has no authority, correct?
Yes.
Or unless perhaps they are invited on or they are asked to work with the tribal police. But it is if something were to happen on tribal land, I'm assuming most tribes have a police force that would be responsible for investigation and handling everything beyond that.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, the part that gets messy is that's only if a tribal member commits a crime against another tribal member.
Okay.
But what we're noticing with the majority of these cases is a non-native person committing a crime against a tribal member. And that's where the federal government is supposed to intervene, because it's a member of their nation committing a crime against a member of a tribal nation. So when the offender is a non-native person, the tribal courts are basically deemed powerless.
When you say a federal agent, we're talking about the FBI, I'm assuming at this point?
Yes.
Okay. And then, so let's say it's a tribal member that is involved in an incident outside of the tribal land, then it would fall to the state police. I'm just trying to paint this picture in my head so I can understand where the loophole exists. I can see how that, I can see how there's plenty of room for that to get dropped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when it is off tribal land, it is normally by state police. However, unfortunately, we'll see that once the person is identified as native, that sometimes state police will kind of back off and be like, well, I don't know if it's our jurisdiction. We should just have a federal agent involved, and then the federal agent never comes. And we're left with, in the state of Washington, hundreds of cold cases.
I'm glad that you brought that up. My next question was going to be, in your estimation, in living in this world and being an advocate for this world, how large of a scope would you estimate the issue of missing or murdered indigenous women is?
I can at least say that 4 out of 5 Indigenous women will experience some form of violence within our lifetimes. In the state of Washington alone, there is 111 cold cases. Unfortunately, there is a lot of data that's kind of misconstrued or simply not there.
Mm-hmm.
In other states. Here in Washington, there's a Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Peoples Task Force. And there are in other states like Colorado and Alaska. However, a lot of Indigenous women are misidentified during crimes, and then the neutral or the assumed identity is normally white, and so there's a lot of these cases that are being being misidentified, and it's really hard to track. And it was only through studies like the Urban Indian Health Institute, which were doing qualitative data. They were going in and interviewing and talking to the tribes and trying to find these loopholes. But what I can say is that every single Native person that I know and that I have met has some relationship to the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis. And there are hundreds of cold cases, at least within the nation, because there's 111 in Washington alone.